Hollywood has spent a century faking height, platform boots, trenches dug behind leading ladies, camera angles built around insecurity. But a small, strange fraternity of stars never touched a single trick. They walked onto sound stages already taller than the legends around them, and the industry had to build its illusions around them instead. Some hid it behind tuxedos and charm. Others turned it into monsters, villains, gods. This is the story of the men Hollywood couldn't shrink, starting with the one whose face you never even saw. Actor number 1, David Prowse. He is, in the strictest sense, invisible in the role that made him immortal. Stand a viewer in front of the original Star Wars trilogy and ask them to name Darth Vader's actor, and most will say James Earl Jones. The voice, the breath, the menace carried in every syllable of that famous rasp. They are only half right. Inside that black armor, beneath the cape and the mask, at a reported 6 feet 6 inches, was a Bristol-born former bodybuilder and strongman named David Prowse, and without his body, Vader is little more than a costume hanging on a rack. Prowse's road into film started nowhere near a soundstage. He trained as a competitive weightlifter and strongman in England, building the kind of scale that made ordinary doorframes look like an afterthought, and that raw physical presence, long before Lucasfilm ever came calling, got him noticed for a string of muscle man roles across British genre cinema. He appeared as the murderous, hulking creation in Stanley Kubrick's A Clockwork Orange, and almost too fittingly, as the monster himself in Frankenstein and the Monster from Hell, roles that leaned entirely on his size to carry menace a mask alone never could. Then came the role that would define him forever, even while erasing his own face from it. Prowse brought the stride, the deliberate weight of every step, the way the character seemed to physically displace air just by entering a corridor, instincts built from a lifetime of inhabiting an oversized body, the kind no vocal performance alone could have invented from scratch. Producers cast him specifically because they needed someone whose real, unexaggerated mass could make an audience believe in a villain built like a walking sarcophagus, someone the camera didn't need tricks to make terrifying. James Earl Jones supplied the voice and the soul of Vader. Prowse supplied the body, the threat, the sheer physical inevitability of him. It's a strange, almost unprecedented kind of stardom, globally iconic and simultaneously anonymous. Hundreds of millions of people can picture the exact shape of Darth Vader's shoulders, the precise cut of that silhouette in a doorway, and almost none of them could pick David Prowse's own face out of a lineup. But that anonymity is, in its own way, the clearest possible proof of how much raw physical presence mattered on those original Star Wars sets. Sometimes a Hollywood giant becomes immortal not through his face at all, but through his posture, his stride, and the shadow he casts down a corridor no one else could fill quite the same way. Somewhere between horror monster roles and galactic villainy, though, an even older kind of Hollywood giant was already ruling a very different kind of set, using not brute force, but pure aristocratic elegance, to become one of the most unforgettable screen presences of his era. Actor number 2, Christopher Lee. Few actors in the history of cinema have ever made villainy feel like ceremony the way Christopher Lee did. At a reported 6 feet 5 inches, Lee didn't so much walk into a scene as arrive at it, and directors who worked with him across 6 decades understood almost immediately that his height wasn't merely a physical fact to be worked around. It was a narrative tool they could build entire sequences on. He rarely needed volume, rarely needed sudden movement. He needed only to stand still and let the room recalibrate itself around him. His breakthrough came soaked in blood. Cast as Dracula for Hammer Films in the late 1950s, Lee took a character that had, by then, drifted toward the quaint and almost comfortable in the public imagination, and made him dangerous again, aristocratic, ancient, unhurried, and genuinely frightening in a way that hadn't been seen since the silent era. That performance essentially redefined horror cinema for an entire generation of filmgoers, and it typecast him for decades afterward, a trap that swallows most actors permanently. Lee, remarkably, did not stay swallowed. Because 2 entirely separate franchises, released decades apart, each independently discovered they needed precisely what he offered. As Saruman the White in Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings trilogy, his height and that unmistakable, resonant voice gave a wizard corrupted by ambition genuine gravity, audiences believed, instantly, that this was a being who had once commanded real and terrible respect before his fall. And then, in the Star Wars prequel trilogy, as Count Dooku, an entirely new generation of viewers who had likely never seen a single Hammer horror picture discovered the exact same unmistakable effect for themselves, calm, controlled, and utterly formidable without raising his voice once. What separated Lee from the era's other tall leading men wasn't the height alone. Plenty of performers of his generation had that. It was the discipline layered on top of it. He stood like a monument and spoke like a verdict, delivering lines with a precision that made stillness itself feel dangerous, a skill few performers before or since have managed to sustain across an entire career, let alone multiple generations of filmmaking. He wasn't merely tall. He was towering in the old Gothic sense of the word, and cinema, across 3 wildly different eras of storytelling, kept finding fresh uses for that particular, singular kind of grandeur, right up until his death in 2015. If Lee proved that a Hollywood giant could rule an audience through pure discipline and control, the next name on this list proved something almost the opposite was equally possible, that a giant could dominate the screen instead through recklessness, unpredictability, and a persona audiences could never quite read from one scene to the next. Actor number 3, John Wayne. Reported at 6 feet 4 inches, John Wayne didn't enter scenes so much as annex them outright. Almost by accident, he became the physical template for an entire American myth, the Western hero, broad-shouldered and unhurried, moving as though the landscape itself had quietly agreed to wait for him to catch up rather than the other way around. That image wasn't accidental. It was built, deliberately, film by film, across decades. In Stagecoach, The Searchers, Red River, and later True Grit, the role that finally won him a long-overdue Academy Award, Wayne refined a very particular rhythm on screen: walk, pause, turn, speak, structured so that every beat of dialogue seemed to catch up to his body rather than the reverse. His sheer height made ordinary doorways look suddenly smaller and made opponents look, just as suddenly, uncertain of themselves before a word was even exchanged. But the real trick was never simply the size. Dozens of tall actors passed through classic Hollywood without ever becoming anything close to what Wayne became. It was the way he weaponized patience, letting silence carry narrative weight that dialogue usually has to shoulder alone, so that when he finally did move or speak, it felt inevitable rather than staged, earned rather than performed. Wayne remains one of the most fiercely debated figures to emerge from classic Hollywood, with his off-screen politics and public persona picked apart by later generations of critics and historians in ways his own contemporaries rarely anticipated during his lifetime. Loved by some, criticized sharply by others, his screen image only grew larger with the passing decades rather than fading. Hollywood didn't simply film John Wayne. The industry built an entire enduring mythology of American masculinity directly around his silhouette, one that directors, actors, and audiences are, in various forms, still arguing about today. Part of what made that silhouette so durable was how deliberately Wayne managed it. He turned down roles that might have softened or complicated the image, and he leaned into westerns and war pictures precisely because those genres gave his height and build the widest possible canvas: open plains, cavalry lines, saloon doorways built, almost literally, to frame a man his size. Directors like John Ford understood this instinctively, staging entire compositions around where Wayne stood rather than where the camera pointed first. That deliberate myth-making is also why his legacy still generates argument decades after his death in 1979. Later critics have pointed to the gap between the rugged, plain-spoken American hero he played on screen and the more complicated, occasionally controversial man who existed off it. But few dispute the raw physical fact that made the whole persona possible in the first place: a 6 feet 4 inches frame that Hollywood's camera operators, art directors, and directors spent 4 decades learning how to build an entire genre around. From myth-building on the open plains, the story now turns to a very different kind of Hollywood giant, one whose reputation was constructed not through control and patience, but through an unpredictability that occasionally spilled off the screen entirely and into the headlines. Actor number 4, Randy Quaid. Randy Quaid, reported at 6 feet 5 inches, never fit neatly into any single Hollywood category, and that sheer unpredictability is exactly what made him so fascinating to watch across a career spanning genres most actors never dare cross. Where other tall actors of his generation settled comfortably into one dependable type, Quaid seemed constitutionally incapable of playing even a familiar scene the safe, expected way. His range, in hindsight, was genuinely strange in the best possible sense. In The Last Detail, he brought raw, aching vulnerability to a young sailor being escorted toward prison, a performance far more tender than his imposing frame might have suggested. In National Lampoon's Vacation, he flipped that entirely, turning Cousin Eddie into one of American film comedy's most beloved and pitiable disasters. In Independence Day, he played a washed-up, disgraced pilot who finds redemption through sacrifice, and across Kingpin and The Long Riders, he shifted registers again and again, comic, tragic, unstable, sometimes convincingly all three within a single scene. That unpredictability was never confined strictly to the screen either. In later years, Quaid's off-camera life grew increasingly erratic and made international headlines for reasons that had little to do with acting craft at all, a trajectory that stood in stark, uncomfortable contrast to the steady, bankable path so many of his 6'4" and taller peers followed through the industry. It remains a career that resists any tidy summary, brilliant in flashes, strange throughout, occasionally alarming toward the end, and never once predictable from role to role or year to year. What ties the whole arc together is the size itself. At 6 feet 5 inches, Quaid never simply disappeared into an ensemble, even in roles explicitly written to let him blend into a crowd. He stood out physically first, and then his choices made you wonder, every time, what he might possibly do next. That's a rarer and stranger gift than raw height alone could ever provide. His early career, in particular, drew serious critical attention that his later comic roles sometimes overshadowed. He earned an Academy Award nomination for The Last Detail, a performance built almost entirely on restraint rather than the outsized presence he'd later become known for, proof that his height was never the only tool in his kit, even if it was always the first thing audiences noticed when he entered a frame. That range, between quiet devastation and broad physical comedy, made him one of the more unpredictable character actors of his generation, long before the headlines of his later years began to define how the public remembered him. It connects him, in an odd way, to the next name on this list, another performer whose off-screen life eventually threatened to eclipse the work that made him famous in the first place. Actor number 5 Armie Hammer. At a reported 6'4½", Armie Hammer looked, for well over a decade, like Hollywood's answer to old studio system casting brought back to life. Tall, symmetrical, aristocratic, the sort of leading man who seemed almost engineered in a laboratory rather than simply discovered on a talent search. His early career was built entirely around that polished image. In David Fincher's The Social Network, he played both Winklevoss twins simultaneously, a technically demanding dual role that required him to register as physically imposing and effortlessly privileged in the very same frame. In The Lone Ranger and The Man from UNCLE, that same tall, polished scale carried big-budget studio action set pieces built explicitly around his size and bearing. And in Call Me By Your Name, he used that same height and easy composure to play a summer romance with a disarming, almost old-fashioned tenderness that many critics singled out as his most acclaimed performance to date. For years, that trajectory suggested a classic Hollywood leading man reborn precisely for a modern streaming-era audience, tall, magnetic, seemingly destined for decades of prestige awards season roles stretching well into the future. Whatever conclusions one draws from the serious public controversies that later reshaped how audiences and the industry viewed him, his early screen presence remains a genuine artifact of how Hollywood casting has always used sheer physical height as instant visual shorthand for privilege, effortless confidence, and emotional distance. Deployed differently in each individual film to entirely different narrative ends depending on what the story required of him. That range is worth remembering precisely because it was so calculated. Casting directors reached for Hammer specifically when a script needed a character whose physical bearing alone communicated old money or easy self-assurance before a single line was spoken. The Winklevoss twins entitled Fury, the Lone Ranger's stiff-backed heroism, Oliver's languid summer confidence in Call Me by Your Name. Few actors of his generation had a frame so immediately legible to both directors and audiences. That legibility is also what makes his story feel unfinished rather than simply concluded. A leading man built almost entirely around the promise of a certain image now exists, in the public record, mostly as a cautionary tale about the distance between screen persona and private conduct, a distance that, for Hammer, turned out to be enormous. From a career defined equally by carefully built image and its very public unraveling, the story shifts now to a giant whose reputation, by sharp contrast, only deepened and grew more complicated the longer his career continued. Actor number 6 Rock Hudson. Rock Hudson, reported at 6 feet 5 inches, looked as though the studio system had deliberately set out to build the perfect leading man and simply kept going well past the usual expected proportions. Through the 1950s and into the 1960s, he became one of the defining romantic stars of his entire era. Giant, pillow talk, magnificent obsession, all that heaven allows. A run of pictures built almost entirely around a very specific American fantasy of masculine glamour, deliberately softened by genuine warmth. That precise balance was the whole trick of his stardom. Hudson could look powerful without ever reading as cruel, polished without ever reading as cold, a combination that made him one of the most reliably adored leading men of the entire studio era, a towering physical presence that audiences somehow experienced, film after film, as fundamentally gentle rather than intimidating. Behind that carefully constructed public image, though, was a private life the studio system worked hard, for years, to keep entirely hidden from the public. Hudson was gay, at a time when that single fact, if it had become public knowledge, could have ended his career outright and destroyed the very image built around him. The performance audiences saw projected on movie screens was, in a very real and painful sense, only ever half of the actual life he was quietly living behind it. His death in 1985 became a pivotal, deeply painful moment in American public life, one of the first widely reported deaths from an AIDS-related illness among the major, beloved public figure, a moment that forced a national conversation the country had largely managed to avoid until that point. Rock Hudson didn't just fit the widescreen era he rose to fame in. He became, in ways audiences and historians only fully understood afterward, one of its most complicated, consequential, and quietly tragic figures. The gap between the image and the man is what makes his story endure. For nearly 3 decades, fan magazines ran stories carefully constructed by the studio to suggest a conventional romantic life, arranged marriages and manufactured girlfriends among them, all built to protect an asset the studio had spent a fortune manufacturing. Hudson himself later spoke, in the final months of his life, about the toll of maintaining that performance both on screen and off it, a second, quieter role he'd been playing for the whole of his career. His public acknowledgement of his diagnosis, and the outpouring of attention it generated, is now widely credited with helping shift American public understanding of the AIDS crisis, even as it came at the cost of his own privacy in his final, difficult months. Where Hudson's giant frame concealed a life he could never safely reveal to the public that adored him, the next name on this list used his own considerable size for something almost entirely opposite, turning it deliberately into pure, controlled, theatrical menace, on purpose, in full view of the camera. Actor number 7 Vincent Price. Vincent Price was never frightening simply because he raised his voice. At a reported 6 feet 4 inches, he was frightening because he loomed, his height lending him a strange, unmistakably aristocratic elegance, like a haunted nobleman who already seemed to know every secret hidden in the room long before the scene had even properly begun. In House of Wax, The Fly, The Pit and the Pendulum, and Theater of Blood, Price turned his physical presence into an instrument of remarkable precision. He moved slowly and deliberately. He spoke with exaggerated care. He let dread accumulate patiently in the space between his carefully chosen words, so that by the time anything actually happened on screen, the audience already felt thoroughly, helplessly trapped alongside whichever unfortunate character he was menacing that evening. That restraint set him apart sharply from many of the era's other horror stars, several of whom leaned almost entirely on physical size for brute, straightforward intimidation. Price did the opposite, consistently, across an entire career. His height gave him theatricality, and his instantly recognizable voice gave him something closer to genuine hypnosis over an audience. Viewers didn't flinch away from him so much as lean forward, unable to look away from a performer who so clearly, visibly relished every single syllable he delivered. He proved, across a body of work spanning several decades and dozens of horror classics, that a true screen giant never actually needs raw muscle to dominate a frame completely. Sometimes Menace wears velvet instead, moves entirely unhurried, and smiles warmly right before delivering the twist. What's easy to forget, given how thoroughly horror defined his later career, is how deliberately Price chose that path. He came from a background steeped in art history and fine dining, a genuinely cultured man who could have built an entirely different career on refinement alone. Instead, he recognized something valuable in his own physical presence, that his height and cultivated voice could turn campy material into something genuinely unsettling, and he leaned into that discovery for the rest of his working life, becoming, by the end of it, horror's most elegant and most beloved ambassador. Where Price mastered horror through pure elegance and restraint, the next figure on this list brought a rawer, far more unpredictable kind of danger to the screen, a man who always seemed one bad decision away from real, tangible trouble. Actor number 8, Sterling Hayden. Sterling Hayden looked less like a trained studio actor and more like someone Hollywood had simply discovered standing on the deck of a storm-battered ship, which, in a strange sense, wasn't actually all that far from the truth of his real life before pictures. Reported at 6 feet 4 inches, he brought a weathered, genuinely restless physicality to film noir and crime cinema that few of his contemporaries in the genre could ever quite match convincingly. In The Asphalt Jungle, Johnny Guitar, The Killing, and later, memorably, in The Godfather, Hayden carried the unmistakable presence of a man who never quite fit comfortably inside ordinary life, whether on screen or off it. His considerable height made him physically imposing without question, but it was the palpable unease simmering underneath that height, the constant sense that his characters were always just one step away from combustion, that made him such a genuinely compelling screen presence decade after decade. He never read as polished on camera, and that lack of polish was precisely the entire point of his appeal. Where other tall leading men of his era were carefully built for old-fashioned glamour, Hayden was built instead for pure grit, a giant with visible cracks running through his own armor, and the camera, across 3 separate decades of noir and crime pictures, never once stopped finding compelling new ways to love those particular cracks. Off-screen, Hayden's restlessness was real, not manufactured for publicity. He'd spent years at sea before acting, running his own schooner and working as a merchant seaman, a background that shaped the physical authenticity audiences responded to on screen. This wasn't a studio-built giant playing at toughness, but a man whose scale and bearing came from an entirely different, harder life before Hollywood ever found him. That authenticity is exactly what directors like John Huston and Nicholas Ray kept returning to him for, casting him not for polish but for the unmistakable sense that he'd actually lived the danger his characters carried. Where Hayden's danger felt deeply personal and permanently unresolved, the next Hollywood giant on this list turned his own imposing frame into something audiences didn't fear at all. Proof that sheer physical size could just as easily build warmth and affection as it could build menace and dread.